Shavua Tov. Today's daf is Mem Zayin. Well, let's go back a little bit to Mem Vav Amid Beis, Boy Rami Bar Chama. So we're counting up about 10 lines before the end of Mem Vav Amid Beis. Hamishtachve lekomas chitin ma'u limenachos. We're entering into a question about shinui, which means when we convert an object from being A and now it's B. For example, in our case, let's say you need flour for menachos. You started with chita, which is wheat, and now you process the wheat and turn it into flour. So the Avoda Zara was done with wheat. Kama means standing wheat. So it's in its natural state. And then you want to use it for menachos, which means that you want to convert it into wheat. And the Gemara's suffix of Rami Bar Chama is the following: Yesh shinu b'nevad or ein shinu b'nevad? Does the fact that he changed the object and its identity, does that mean that the old prohibition of Avoda Zara, which was generated on wheat, no longer is applicable to flour? Or do we say no? Once the Torah says, Torah says, Ki'ilu, I don't want to have anything to do with Avodah Zarah, then there was a chalos Avodah Zarah that was chal with the Iser of Cherem as a result of the worshipping of the wheat, and you can't change that. You can't be mafkia that through Shinu. Omar Mar Zutra Bereid Rav Nachman, Toshma, I have an answer from a brayso. Kol ha'asurim legabi mizbeach v'ladoseya mutarim. Okay, so this is the sheet of the Tanakama, who is more makil than Rabbi Eliezer, as we'll soon see. According to the shita of the Tanakama, if you have something that was, in this case, either a nevad or nirva, and now you want to use that animal on the mizbeach, so the animal itself is a problem, but what about its offspring? Now the offspring undergoes a shinui. After it's born, and now you want to bring it on the mizbeach, it's no longer in its original state of being an embryo in its mother's womb. So therefore, the Chachamim came to the conclusion that even though the mother of this worshipped or sodomized animal is disqualified for the mizbeach, but nevertheless the vlad is mutter. V'toni Allah, but the brayso quotes the dissenting opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, Oser. And therefore, Mar Zutra basically takes this brayso, and he thinks that the moment of time, you see, there's T1 and T2. T1 is when the mother became pregnant, and T2 is when she was either worshipped or sodomized. And we're going to see now in the sugya that the question is, what came first? So the premise here of Mar Zutra is that the mother was pregnant at the time that she was worshipped or sodomized. And therefore, the act of worship and sodomy was done on the animal and its fetus, because the fetus was already in existence. And therefore, what is the machlokus between the Tanakama and Rabbi Eliezer? Mar Zutra suggests that this issue that divides the Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer is identical with the issue of Rami Bar Chama. Because when the Tana says that the mother gave birth, and therefore you can use the newborn animal on the Mizbeach, he was holding that shinui, that change from a fetus, a state of fetus to a state of a yilud, of being born, is enough to undermine the Isser of the Psul of Nevad or the Psul of Avodah Zara, whereas Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion, no. Once the act of sodomy or worship was done to the mother and the fetus is an extension of the mother, that's called Uber Yerech Imo, then Shinui is not going to make any difference. So the Gemara rejects it and says, La Vitmar lo, no. You're missing the point about this brisa and the Machlokas Rabbanon and Rabbi Eliezer. Omer Rav Nachman, Omer Rav Avur, Machlokas kishenirva'u ulobasof ibru. That the revia, the sodomy, or same halach in the worship, took place on the mother animal before she was pregnant. So therefore, there was never a moment of time when the sodomy or the idol worship was directed towards the fetus. And now we turn to Daf Mem Zayin. Avol ibro l'basof nirvu kuli divrei hakol asurim. If the mother was pregnant and therefore the act of sodomy or worship was done directly to the mother and her fetus, that means that the ibur took place at time T1 and the revia or the shtachava took place at time T2. So once at time T1, the fetus became prohibited as part of its mother by virtue of the status of nevad or nirva. Therefore, everybody agrees, even the chachamim will concede that the vlad, meaning the shinu, is not going to be mafkia that psul of nevad or nishtachva. If that be the case, then the whole machlokas here between the Rabbanon and Rabbi Eliezer is a case where the mother was not pregnant at the time of the nevad or nirva situation. Now let's go back to the case of the wheat. Hani nami ki ibro ulabasof nirvu damu. At the time that the worship of this wheat was implemented, the wheat was in existence. So therefore, it's parallel to the case where the ibur took place before the shtachava. And therefore, everybody would agree, according to Rav Nachman, even the chachamim, that shinui, by taking the wheat and converting it into flour, that does not remove or undermine the iser of Avodah Zara. Ika diamri. Now, the Ika diamri that we're about to learn is not a typical Ika diamri, which means a whole different version, but rather, according to the second Lishna, it was Mar Zutra himself who came up with this distinction. Machlokes shenirvu b'sof ibru, aval ibru b'sof nirvu direkol osav hachanami ki ibru b'sof nirvu dami. So the Gemara now is bothered by this logic. Hachi hashta, let's check this out. Hasam, in the case of the animal made kara behema v'hashta behema, the shinui is not really that profound because even as a fetus, it was an animal in its mother's womb. So therefore, after the avoda, when it was worshipped, or nirva, the animal that emerges from its mother's womb as a yalud, as a born animal, is really the same as the fetus. But what was preventing the fetus from being a viable being? Dasha hudachiza banpa. There was like a door that was closed. And the animal, meaning the fetus in this case, could not cross the threshold because of the closed door. But hacha, in contrast, in the case of chita meikara chita v'hashta kimcha, there was nothing holding the chita back, the wheat, from becoming flour. Flour is a whole new entity. And therefore, it could be that in this case, everybody might agree that there's no Iser Avoda Zara on the Kemach because the Kemach is after Shita. It's a new identity. And that seems to close this sugi. By Rav Sheshes has another suffix. Hamishtach dekel lulavo ma'ul mitzvah. Until now, we've been saying that a nevad, which was worshipped, is pasul a mizbeach. What about a mitzvah like lulav? That's not a mizbeach. And it seems to me that, although nobody says what I'm about to tell you, that Reish Lakish was vacillating as to whether or not a lulav is also like considered al gabi mizbeach. And that's in the sugi of mitzvah baver in the third parak of Sukkah. Anyway, if that palm tree, that lulav tree, was planted initially for the purpose of idol worship, then afilu lehejot nami yoser. It's mamish avodah zarah, and it's a cheftzah d'isura, and you can't benefit from it, and you certainly can't fulfill a mitzvah with it. Well, what I just told you is not really true. As the Rishonim point out, there's a principle called mitzvos lav lahenos nitnu. Maybe we won't get into that now, but Reish Lakish apparently rejected that principle. So therefore, again, if the original planting was done for the purpose of idol worship, everybody would agree that the lulav is completely disqualified for the mitzvah of lulav. What case is the suffix of Reish Lakish be'ilan shenetol l'basof avoda? At the moment that he planted this tree, he had no intention whatsoever to use it for idol worship, make it into an asherah. But at the end, way beyond the original Natiya, when the Elon produced its branches, then he decided he's going to make it into an idol. Now, what the Gemara is going to do is, this Gemara is going to tell us that there's another machlokes between Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and the Rabbanon, and we'll see what that machlokes is about. We've had it already in the past, I believe on Mem Hey. And the Gemara is going to say that I'll leave it to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, you have no question, Reish Lakish. The question doesn't get off the ground. Why? Because afilu lehejot nami yoser. According to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, even as far, forget about mitzvah, forget about mizbeach, even as far as my own personal use, if this lulav was worshipped, then it no longer has the status of what's called mechuber lekarka, which was the case for the lulav before it was cut off the tree. It was connected to the karka like a har, like a mountain. And therefore, according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, it now has a new status as far as Avodah Zarah is concerned. Forget about the fact that it was once mechuber lekarka. He worshipped it when it was tolush. It was completely cut off. And therefore, if it's asur, v'toras Avodah Zarah, according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, there's no doubt about it, you can't use it for the mitzvah of lulav. It's mos. It's disgusting for a mitzvah, for Avodas Hashem. Kiti boilecha, when does Reish Lakish have an issue? I'll leave it to Rabbanan. The Rabbanan are those who say that if the original planting of the tree was for a mundane purpose, not for the purpose of religious idolatry, then we view the lulav, or for that matter, anything that's broken off, like the Gemara talks about a stone that breaks off from the mountain or from the hill, and the Rabbanan say that that stone does not become awesome, even if it's worship. But maybe le'inyan mitzvah maybe mitzvah should be elevated to a higher status, similar to mizbeach, and the disqualification as something that could be brought on the mizbeach. And even Rabbi Yos, even the Rabbanan of Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda agree that as far as Mizbeach is concerned, you can't, right? Mi moes klapi gavoa ola. There's a psul in something that was never, as far as Mizbeach is concerned, called mos. It's repulsive for the Mizbeach. Here also, for serving Hashem in a mitzvah, it's repulsive. Ki also Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael. Omar, he declared, Ba'ashera shebitla kami boile. Reish Lakish's suffix was a different suffix entirely. He was talking about an Asherah. The Asherah was nullified as it was standing. Of course, by a guy, because if it's nullified by a Jew, then that's not operative. And Reish Lakish's suffix really had nothing to do with a mitzvah, but rather had to do with the principles that govern bittul. And therefore, we're talking about an Asherah. Asherah is a tree that was planted for the sake of Avoda Zara. I'm sorry. What are we talking about now? Just give me a minute for a second. So yeah, let's go over this one more time so we get the mathematics. What Rav Dimi is telling us when he gets to Bavel is that if you were talking about using the lulav for a mitzvah, then that would be permissible. And why is that? Reish Lakish would not have any doubt about it, because it was not planted for the purpose of Avodah Zarah. Therefore, Avdimi says that Reish Lakish's suffix revolves around an Asherah. And now the question is whether Bittul could be mafkia the Isra Avodah Zarah in the Asherah. Now, what is this issue all about? So this is going to introduce a sugya called dichui. But let me give a little bit of an introduction to the sugya of dichui. The purpose of bittul is to take something that's asur and make it mutter. Before the bittul, it was designated as an asherah, and it's asur, and you can't get any benefit for anything, for any secular purpose. But now there was bittul. At the moment before bittul, if let's say he would have wanted to take a branch of the asherah tree and use it for a mitzvah like lulav, he could not do so, because before bittul it was asur midin avodas kochavim, and that's called dichui. That means it was rejected for the mitzvah. So now the machlokas is yesh dichui el mitzvah, so ein dichui el mitzvah. Reish Lakish was vacillating whether or not something that was rejected and disqualified from being used for a mitzvah can now be reinstated. Or shall we say that once it was dachui, that's it. It can never be used. In Mizbeach, we have halacha of yesh dichui eitzel Mizbeach. But what about eitzel mitzvahs? And the Gemara says, Tifshol le'mi d'snan, I have a Mishnah. So now we get into the mitzvah of kisui hadam, which means that let's say he slaughters a bird and he's got to cover the blood of the bird. And now what happens is a wind comes by before he gets a chance to cover the bird with offer, and the wind now brings the offer, the dust and the dirt to cover the dam. Then later on, either a wind or by human intervention, he was able to expose the dam again. Kiso v'nisgale potamim l'chalos. But kiso ruach chayav l'chasos. So let's take the sefer first. That's the more relevant case. Kiso ruach. The wind, as we said before, brought the dust and covered the blood. And now the blood became exposed again. And the halacha is chayav l'chasos. So that means ein dichui eitzel mitzvos. Even though a minute ago it was impossible and rejected from the mitzvah of kisi adam, now we revert back to its original state when it was roy l'kisi. Now, in the Reisha that we skipped, he already fulfilled the mitzvah of Kisi Adam on the first round. Now it got re-exposed. He doesn't have an obligation to do a second Kisi on that Dam. Okay, After the wind covered the blood, it became exposed again. If it did not become re-exposed, so then you're not chayav to kisi v'avida. But we ask the question: Ki chazav v'nisgala mai havi. Who cares if it was exposed again? It was dachui the minute before it was exposed. V'hol ve'idchi idchi. Amar Papa is also there saying dichel mitzvahs. So we prove from this Mishnah in Chulin that ein dichui eitzel mitzvahs. And if ein dichui eitzel mitzvahs, then why did Reish Lakish have a suffix about the case of something that was excluded for a mitzvah because it was also b'adam did avoda Zara, and then there was bittul? And the Gemara answers the Rav Papa Gufei Iboile. Rav Papa came up with the conclusion that ein dichui eitzel mitzvahs. Reish Lakish was not convinced that that's the proper, accurate conclusion to draw. Mifsha pshito leila Rav Acha Rav Papa ein dichui mitzvahs lo shana l'kula lo shana l'chumra. O dilma sfuke mesafkale ulachumra minan lekula lo amrina. Maybe Rav Papa did not really know whether yesh dichui eitzel mitzvahs or ein dichui mitzvahs. So he was in a state of suffix. What does he do in a state of suffix? So it could be that we have to go l'chumra. And if we go l'chumra, then we have to reject it from being royal mitzvah. And we have to say yesh dichui eitzel mitzvahs. Or shall we say no? Lo shna l'kula, lo shna l'chumra. When Rav Papa said ein dichui eitzel mitzvahs, and therefore he's still chayav in kisi adam, then it would make no difference whether that was a chumrah or a kula. And the Gemara says, Teku, we really don't know how to resolve this suffix. Boy Rav Papa, another suffix. This seems to be, at face value, a repetition of what we discussed earlier. Namely, about hishtachava of an ubar, and then the ubar is born, and there's a shinui. Here too, he's mishtachva to a behema, and now he shears off the wool of the animal, the sheep, let's say. Right, there are people who worship sheep, and he wants to take that wool and dye it for tcheles and use it for the mitzvah of tzitzis. So Gemara says tcheles demai. Well, what's the case? Eat tcheles l'kohanim. If you talk about big day kohanim, well, then it depends upon whether big day kohanim have the status of mizbeach or not. Hainu boy deron b'chom. That's an old question. I don't need Rav Papa to raise this question, and that is whether or not we define Big Day Kuna as just machshirei avoda, it's only a preparation for the avoda, or it's really an integral part of the avoda, and therefore all the chumras of kachim, of karbanos, would apply to tchelis. The eat tchelis letzitzis, ella, what by possible nation you're going to say that he's wondering about using this wool to make tchelis for the purpose of tzitzis? Well, hainu to boy reish lakish. I mean, basically, Rav Papa is just simply repeating the same suffix that we had in Reish Lakish. Namely, Reish Lakish was vacillating back and forth about something that was originally worshipped, and then there was a shinoi. And here too there was a shinoi, because he cuts off the wool, and it's a different entity. Well, it says, Einochinami, Delohavi mi boile. Truth is that Rav Papa didn't add anything. He's just reiterating the old issue of Rami Bar Chama, or alternatively of Reish Lakish. So why did he ask this question? He really wanted this to lead into a different discussion. Samra ma'olit chelis. What's the deal with using the wool of this animal for tcheles? And that was an introduction to his next question. Karneha ma'ol lechatzotzos, right? We have a mitzvah of blowing the chatzotzos during the avoda, and now he wants to take the karnayim, meaning the horns from this animal that was worshipped, and use it for the trumpets of the mizbeach, or shukeh ma'ol lechalilin. And he wants to take the bones of this animal from its forelegs, apparently, and make it into flutes. And this was all for the shira of the Levium that accompanied the Nisuch HaYayin in the Mizbeach, B'nei Me'el Ma'al Liporos. Well, what about taking the intestines of this animal and making strings for the harp, which also accompanied the Shira Salaviyah? So someone worshipped a behemoth, and now, after the animal is dead, we want to take different parts of the animal, the tzemer, the karnayim, the premeayim, and the shukayim, and we want to use it for various dimensions of the Shira Salaviyah. Can we do so? Does it have the status of Mizbeach? So again, as far as Big Day Kohen is concerned, does it have the same status as Mizbeach? That's a suffix of Rami Bar Chama. As far as Shinu is concerned, that was a suffix of Reish Lakish. But our suffix, Rav Papa's suffix, is about the status of musical instruments with regard to the Shir Salaviyim. If you go with the Machlokes, here we have a controversy about what is the primary critical essence of the mitzvah of Shir Salaviyim. Is it Shira B'peh? And the musical sounds are just accompaniment, it's a background noise. Or should we say no? That Ikar Shira B'kli, that the musical accompaniment is not just a background and it's insignificant, but it's part of the essence of the mitzvah of Shira Salaviyim, as if to say that the Shira of the Levium somehow harmonizes together with the music to form one entity. Since the whole purpose of the musical instruments is just as a background secondary accompaniment. And what's the purpose of these instruments? Is bisume kala ba'alma hu umaisinan. We only bring it to enhance the sound of the songs of the Levium. Odelma filu hachiyasa. Well, maybe we should say that even if it's only a background music to sweeten the voice and the sounds of the Kohanim, nevertheless, of the Levium, nevertheless, it still should be prohibited, teku. Boy, Rabba has another suffix. He bows down to a spring of water. Now he wants to take the water and use it for the mitzvah of Nisuch HaMayim, which was done during the days of Sukkot. My Kobi boil. Again, the Gemara wants to understand the suffix. If you're talking about a case of Abua Kosogid, he's only worshiping the reflection that he sees from looking in the water, but he has no intention of making the water into a deity. So then why would it be awesome? Meaning, why would this water of the river have a status of Avodah Zara? He's not worshiping the water. Oh, Dilma, Lemaya Kosagid, or maybe he's worshiping the water itself. We could ask the same question with regard to a seifel. A seifel is a bowl, right? And you dig the water in the you dig the bowl, in the water, and now the question is whether even a hedger is allowed to use it if the water has a status of cherem, of avodah zarah. So why did Rabbah raise his question as far as Nisuch HaMayim is concerned? Liolam lemaya kasav. He bows down to the water itself. What was Rabbah's suffix? Lemaya dekame kasagid. Is it only that he's right? The river keeps flowing. So is he worshiping just this water that's standing in front of him as he bows down? The kame kame ozu, and now that water was pushed down the river, and therefore the new water that replaced it is mutter, and you could use it for Nisuch HaMayim. O Dilma lidavruna demaya kosagid. He was worshiping not this particular water that's in front of him, but rather all the water in the river. Now, how does this answer the Gemara's question about a bowl? Let me just see if he points this out. Okay. Now, there's a long discussion here about whether or not the shadow, the reflection that he sees of the water is considered mechuber lekarka. Okay, fine. So Gemara now raises the following question: Me mitzvah, right? Can you prohibit can something that belongs to nature, like a nature reserve, you can't make it into avodah zarah because ein adam oseh davar she'ein shalom. Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rav Shimon ben Yotzadok mayim shel rabim einam nesarim. There's public water, and everybody has access and rights to that river. And now he comes along and he wants to worship it. He doesn't have the legal power to create an Isra Avodah Zarah. It's public in its ownership. It has to do with land that's owned by this idol worshiper, and in the land is a river, and therefore he owns private property, private possession over the river. Mishnah. A man has a wall that's common to both the idolatrous temple on the one side and to his field on the other side. Okay, so now that separation, that wall that separates the two, fell. It's very reminiscent of the second parak of Baba Basra. Basu livnoso. He's not allowed to rebuild the wall. Why? Because by the Jew rebuilding the wall, he's benefiting Avodah Zarah. Because now they have a wall on their side. Ketzad Yasa. So what does he do? I mean, after all, he needs a wall to separate his field from the temple. He's got to move into his karka 4 amos, and there he could build a wall. Because then that wall is considered as serving only his field and not the Avodah Zarah. But what about a case of Shalom v'Shel Avodas Kochavim? Let's say the wall itself was owned jointly by both the temple and the Jew. And here we turn to Mem Zayin Amid Beis.